Today's topic is ecology, and we scientists, you included, gain valuable insights into looking at how living things and non living things interact with one another. And that's kind of just a generality as far as what ecology is. So, when we look at some of the topics, one of them is going to be energy that we'll consider, along with some of those interactions that are occurring between living things, whether it's animal to animal or from plant to animals. So, those are all kind of some of the topics that we'll cover here. Um, One of the things that we'll start off with is just that general idea of ecology. And what we'll see is that it's really kind of a study of these interactions, as I stated, between organisms with their living and their non living components. So let me try to get this out of the way so you can see all this. There you go. And that's what we'll start with is think about your own interactions with the outdoors and some of those living interactions that you're having with other people or other organisms. Maybe you're a botanist and you're interested in trees and other plant life and their interactions not only with you but also other organisms. So, one of the things that we have to consider the term is biotic, and that is all those living components in the environment. We have biotic and another term called abiotic, and abiotic are all those non living components within the environment. So, we're looking at many things that influence the ecosystem or the ecosystem that we inhabit and live within. So if we look at just purely some of the levels of organization, as I mentioned, like ecosystem, where does that all play out here? Well, in your textbook, you'll see a similar diagram to this, where we're looking from kind of a top-down organization, where we start big, we're looking at the big biosphere of the Earth. And that's the part of the planet which the atmosphere is contained in. It does contain small amounts of life, but not a lot. The next level down, if we can go into that, is referred to as the biomes. And these are sections or groups of an ecosystem that have similar characteristics in climate and communities. In other words, they're living communities. Um, Another layer down, getting closer, going from the top down to a smaller component, is called the ecosystem. And you'll see oftentimes we will use the term ecosystems even here in Minnesota. And this is where all the organisms and some of the living and non living components are located. Continuing on with this idea is this idea of the next level is the biological community, where all these organisms are interacting. It could be within a aquatic system like water, or it could be on land, but where are all these organisms interacting within a specific geographic area? If we go down even further, we're looking at maybe a population, all those members of the species living in one particular place. And on the diagram here, you can see the ecosystem in an aquatic marine environment down by the coast of Florida. And as we move from right to left, here's our population of a particular fish species going into that particular name called an organism. And that's the individual living thing within that broad sphere. So we're going from top to a very specific component of that. So from biological communities, populations, and organisms. One in particular term we use within this context is a habitat, and that's where the organism lives. Another term, the niche, the role or behaviors that organisms has within its environments. Now, the picture obviously is kind of a strange picture from a zoo where you have a giraffe and hippos, and obviously somewhere in the United States here where you're going to have those two interacting, which normally wouldn't happen. But I thought it was kind of a cool photo. So niches are the roles and behaviors of these organisms within its environment. So that includes some of the mating behaviors, feeding, in other words, what they're feeding and drinking, and then other impacts that those species have within the environment. So habitat and niche. So if we look at one of the key elements in ecology, we're looking at how this all species are interconnected. We know that life has certain characteristics from our earlier ideas and classes that we've had, but there's this interconnectedness that occurs within living species. So if we look at this, all organisms interacting within a particular area with some of the living and non-living environmental factors. So this can change in an ecosystem, and one species can affect many others. So for example, I have a picture of a deer, a mouse, some acorns, some red oak trees, some gypsy moths, and of course humans. And the last one is the little deer tick down below here. And I bring this out because obviously, if you have a bumper season of acorns, for example, the red oaks are just exploding here in Minnesota, and we have a bumper acorn season. Well, that's going to influence the number of, for example, mice that can use that as a food source, along with white-tailed deer. So these two in general will feed upon the acorns produced by this red oak. Well, the more mice and the more deer you have, the more potential you'll have for deer ticks. In other words, you follow the arrows here, how one is going to influence the other. In other words, deer ticks population will be influenced by these two organisms. And of course, we as humans interacting in and amongst the forests where these mice and these deer are located can also influence our health and well-being as a result of being exposed to these deer ticks. We know that deer ticks carry many diseases. One in particular is Lyme disease. So the more higher the number of deer ticks, we could probably bring that back and show the interconnectedness that those deer ticks have had with these particular organisms, and even relate it back to the original red oak. So all these have an influence within each other. So Lyme disease, as I said, can be correlated to maybe even acorn production. We can do research to indicate its positive and negative effects. Another important issue in ecology is population growth. We're seeing the human population steadily increase exponentially if you look at the graph. And one of the ideas in ecology is how much can our current biosphere and all the living things can support as far as human life. And so the shape of this graph down below is this exponential growth. And we ecologists, we agree that human population is growing at a rate that's unsustainable. And so a lot of models out there, if we look at, for example, where we're currently at, somewhere in the low teens as far as billions of people, and some projections as far as the growth rate, we can estimate the population as it's predicted in the upcoming years. So if we, increase it by 16 billion years, or maybe even drop the population by 6 billion years, we can make some estimations as far as how we're going to influence planet Earth. And we can see that. Now, what would decrease the population? Well, we just came through a spell of the epidemic of COVID, and we can see how disease definitely influences populations like humans. And that can have a negative impact. And that goes for anything, whether it's a lion or a tiger or a bear, plants, they're all impacted by disease, or certainly influenced by disease. One of the, I'm just going to go back here, some of the important issues. So number one, human populations. Number two is some of the mass extinctions that we've recorded in Earth's history, and we're currently in one, and we are the culprit. The sixth mass extinction is directly a result of humans and their interactions with our planet. Now, there's been wide estimates, and we're seeing that come to life, unfortunately, that 1/5 of the world's species will disappear within our lifetime, within the next 100 years. The last really major mass extinction that we saw that was recorded was probably back in the dinosaur era, where we had these massive meteorites influence life here on planet Earth. So the speed at which this is happening currently with man's influence is happening at a much faster rate than some of those earlier extinctions that we had seen from past history. A third item here is the thinning of the ozone. Now, I want to distinguish what the thinning of the ozone and what that is. If you look at the top of the Earth here, these these graphs or these pictures, what you'll notice is that we have discolorization from green to blues. And the part of the upper atmosphere that this is trying to indicate, this green, is the ozone. And that's a positive thing. It filters out some of the ultraviolet light rays from the sun. Some of these effects, if there's too much ultraviolet light rays coming in, can cause skin cancers and damage just life in general. So we have, man has made industrial chemicals called CFCs. And we know that when they get released, it influences the ozone layer. Now, we're not going to go into a lot of that information yet, but what you need to be aware of is that as a result of some of these CFCs and other chemicals that have been released, not only here in the United States, but worldwide, it has caused a hole. About 50% of some of those influences was found in the Antarctic area. So a reduction of 50% is significant. And so some of these harmful ultraviolet light rays can reach these areas and cause destruction of, for certainly, of living things. So CFCs are now banned. They're an illegal thing that the United States and other major countries have tried to limit or reduce completely. But they're still, unfortunately, used in other areas, some of those third world countries where those legislation pieces have not come about. So the ozone does show some recovery that is occurring. And one of the things that, as a result of some of the legislation, is that we have seen that these ideas of ozone has nothing to do with global warming, which I wanted to point out here. Global warming is what oftentimes gets linked with global warming is the idea of the greenhouse effect. In the last election, the term is brought out, the green revolution and other pieces of that. Well, let's just explain what that means. Greenhouse gases, like carbon dioxide, which comes from your vehicles, methane and water, act like a blanket. And so if you look at when they're being released, these greenhouse gases, but by themselves aren't necessarily harmful to a small degree, but they do, as they accumulate on the upper atmosphere, the biosphere, accumulate and act like a blanket holding in the heat of the earth. Much like you would put on your blanket to keep you warm, these gases are acting similarly to planet Earth. So burning of these fossil fuels releases CO2 and methane in the upper atmosphere, along with the extensive amounts of water. Things like livestock farming, in other words, the cows and pigs that we use for our food supplies, certainly increases the methane supply. Even cow farts, I put that down, certainly increases the amount of methane being released and certainly affects the greenhouse effect. So according to some of the published works here, we have the concentration of CO2 and methane have increased dramatically, 148% respectively since the 1700s. So this is going to influence temperature. And that's one of the noted things about the greenhouse gases, that they are raising the Earth's temperature, and that's been well documented. So as the temperatures rise, so also will the water evaporating on the Earth's surface at a higher rate. When this gets into the atmosphere, water is this greenhouse gas too, and certainly influences the blanket effect of the planet. So based on some of these models, the surface air warming in the 21st predictions is that we're going to increase the temperatures from maybe up to 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit difference. And that means that some of the sea levels, which most of the Earth is, will also be raising. Low estimates, maybe 7, maybe high estimates of 23 inches. So this is a significant change that we have not seen before, certainly in our lifetime or before. So some of the intergovernmental panels that I just quoted here also suggest that that this is very likely to increase some of these warm spells, heat waves, in events like some of the amounts of rainfalls. So we're already seeing this, and whether it's likely or very likely, some of these increases, drought intensities. Think about what's happening in California right now. In California, We're having these constant bombardments of rain influencing mudslides and other potential problems in this drought-filled area along most of California. So sea ice, just kind of FYI, is protected to some degree, but it is shrinking as a result of some of these warmer seawaters. And in the summer ice is disappearing in a lot of areas and entirely in parts of some of those areas that we would normally see big, vast, thick bands of ice. Um, so, how is climate changing affecting the oceans? Well, what we're seeing is some of the, as I said, the ideas of warmer oceans. Melting of the polar ice is certainly another influence. Rising sea levels, more intense weather patterns that we can see on a daily basis, whether it's tornadoes, cyclones, increased snow amounts, or some of those other changing effects in the summer and or winter. Changing ocean currents, ocean acidifications, in other words, changing the pH within the oceans, which would influence the water movements and some of these other things as a result of carbon dioxide and water mixing with each other, creating what we refer to as carbonic acid. You might be familiar with carbonic acid as something that you can find in some of your beverages like Coke and Pepsi. That's all carbonic acid. In other words, an acid as a result of changing the amount of CO2 within that when it's interacting with water. This causes coral bleaching. In other words, the acidification changes the ability for this coral to live in certain geographic areas. And again, the coral that is rich and vibrant in color loses its ability for those corals to grow, and they actually turn white, which is a discolorization and an absence of living things. So the whiteness that you can see in corals that can sometimes be decorated on the shelves is not necessarily a positive thing. That means that there's an absence of living things within that.